Hi, my name is Sarah Lubetsky, and I am the Clinical Research Manager for the Department of Geriatrics and Palliative Medicine at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Today, I am here to talk to you about consenting research subjects and what is involved. So, first things first, people make mistakes on consent forms. You would be surprised how often this is not done perfectly. So, an audit that I was involved in actually had 78 findings, and this is what they looked like. So we found uh, a lot of corrections that weren't initialed. We found the initial section, which we will talk about later, being incomplete, incorrect information, some major findings like missing counter signatures that could quite literally invalidate the consent form. So I just want to make the point that things happen, and we want to prevent those things from happening. So making the point that informed consent must always be obtained and documented per the study protocol before any data are collected, except to the extent that that the IRB has approved a waiver. So sometimes, for example, for recruitment, we might receive some data to help us identify potential participants before those participants have consented to participate in a study. This is allowed, assuming the IRB has approved it. But without that, informed consent absolutely must be obtained and documented before we collect any data. All right, so this is what the front page of a consent form looks like. And granted, these templates get changed from time to time. Sometimes the stamp gets changed. A couple years ago, it was in the upper right-hand corner, and it included a seal. This is a more recent version. It could look different now. The thing I want to draw your attention to is this expiration date. You should always be checking that you have a stamp on your consent form with the expiration date before you consent your patient, before you even bring the consent form to a consent appointment. So please, please always make sure that your consent form is stamped and unexpired. If you find that your consent forms have expired, you may need to go into Ruth, which is our IRB management system, and download a more recent version. There also could be a more recent version of the consent form, so just make sure you're always using the most recent version. As you're going through it, you shouldn't be writing anything in the margins or anywhere that is not directly indicated on the consent form. And please, please, please never write the study ID of the patient anywhere on the consent form. This is about protecting patient privacy. We keep study IDs separate. So as we review the consent form with the patient, you should go through and paraphrase each section. There are some pieces of this that are particularly important, so they should know what they're going to be responsible for, the time commitment involved, if there are any particular risks, any benefits. Most of our studies are considered not for benefit studies, and you should always remember that compensation is not considered a benefit. It is simply compensation for their time and effort that they deserve for giving us their time and participating with us. At the end of your review of the consent form, you should ask the potential research subject questions. Ask them to talk to you about their understanding of what you just discussed. And yeah, and key questions are very important too. So making sure they really understand the procedures and the time commitment involved and risks, benefits, and the fact that most importantly, participation is voluntary. They do not have to sign the consent form. They are still eligible for any benefits that they otherwise would have been entitled to. It will not affect their patient care in any way. Yeah, very, very important to emphasize those things. Also important that they know who they can contact if there's a problem. You should definitely be giving your work contact details to the research subject, but remember not to write them on the consent form, because again, we are not putting anything in the margins or anywhere else on this form that is really a legal document. Yeah, and just last but not least, we have some studies that recruit people who speak more than one language. And you should always ensure that the consent form and the consent conversation and the interview are all happening in the same language, and that language is the subject's preferred language. So for example, if this is a study that is recruiting English and Spanish speakers, and you have a subject who speaks both, you should ask which language they want to use for research purposes, or which one they're more comfortable in. Okay. So this is what I call the initialing section of the consent form. And it asks a lot of questions about research registry participation and data banking. So all I really have to say about it is that you should go through step by step. If there are instructions that say, no, please stop here, then you should stop there and not ask the rest of the questions. However, assuming you are not supposed to stop here, then you should fill every single question out. None of these should be left blank. They should always have the subject's initials, not, for example, a check mark. And that's really all there is to it. You shouldn't ever have a situation where both options are initialed. We really just need to make sure that this section is completed fully and correctly. So as we get to the final page of the consent form, you will see that we have 3 signature blocks. There's one for the participant. There is one for the research coordinator or the person who is obtaining consent. And there is one that is sometimes used for a witness. So if we're doing a typical in-person consent, this is what it should look like. The adult participant would sign first, and then after, the research coordinator would countersign. We're only going to move to signature after we feel very confident that the research subject understands all elements of the consent form fully. We need to feel comfortable that that person can provide informed consent. And if they cannot demonstrate understanding of the consent form, they should not be providing written consent, because again, their written consent would not be informed consent. So again, the subject will sign first, the research coordinator will sign second, and there are some situations where a witness may be needed. So I think the the less common ones that we run into on a daily basis are that the subject can't read or sign the consent form. We also use the witness section in remote consents when the subject isn't going to physically sign the consent form, and we have to have a witness participate in the consent so that everyone can feel comfortable that a verbal consent was an informed consent. So without further ado, remote consenting is more work. This is the Mount Sinai IRB's remote consent policy, or some language taken directly from it. But it gives us a general idea of what we're supposed to do when we are consenting someone remotely. So we always have to send the consent form to them in advance of the conversation, whether that be by mail or by email. They need to be able to physically look at a document or electronically look at a document, but one that's in their possession as you are going through the consent conversation. So you will arrange for said conversation, and once you feel comfortable, just as with any other consent conversation, that the person understands everything, you ask if they want to consent to participate in the research study. And in most cases, a verbal consent is considered acceptable, assuming that this is a part of your study protocol. We should always have a witness to these conversations, as in step 3 here, because if we do not have a witness who is signing the consent form and participating in that conversation, we may have to throw out the data later if the consent form is not signed in a reasonable amount of time. So please, if you are on a study that is approved to do remote consent, which is most of our studies in the department, please always arrange for a witness to your remote consents. So this is what a completed consent form would look like in the case of a remote consent. You would fill out the pertinent information for the participant, but it would be left unsigned in the top signature block. Once verbal consent has been obtained, you would sign the form as the research coordinator, and your witness would sign after you. Again, all of these signatures have to happen in a very particular order. Really, everything on this form for a remote consent should be filled out, except for the participant signature. There's another situation I can think of in which a witness would need to be present, and that is for studies that involve people who speak languages other than English and are being consented through an interpreter. So in that case, you would also need a witness to the conversation per protocol, and that person would be signing in the witness section. And sometimes things don't happen the way we expect it to. Sometimes people don't sign where we were expecting them to. Sometimes someone does put a check mark instead of their initials in that initialing section. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we do when we have to correct information. So I would ask that rather than erasing something or trying to scribble it out completely, just cross it out with a single line so that we can see the original information. And you can correct the information as needed. You can write what is needed directly above the section that you crossed out. And most importantly, please sign and date the correction. You should only be correcting information that you have entered for yourself. So for example, if the subject who you are consenting messed something up, they put the wrong year, for example, then that subject is responsible for making that correction. So you can point it out to them in the moment, assuming that you have noticed, and give them instructions on how to make the correction. So again, cross it out, write the correct information above, and initial and date it. And if you were unable to do that, then you would have to write a memo. And if you ever have to write a memo to your consent form because something is inaccurate, please just let me know and I will give you further instructions on that. So similarly, I have an example here on the initial section. I think this is the best way to handle it. If someone puts a check mark, for example, you can just put the initials right next to it. Nothing wrong with that. Sorry, and by putting the initials, I mean the subject putting their own initials. So I just want to, circle back and make the point that these are best practices and they protect the human subjects that we're working with on our studies. They protect us, they protect our PIs. Yeah, really important that not only do we have a complete conversation of the consent form, but we also document consent appropriately. Any questions?
Thanks so much, Sarah.
You're welcome.
Where can we find the most updated version of consent forms if we're not sure where they are?
Ooh, what a great question. So if you are ever unsure, you should log into Ruth. You should find the most recent modification or continuation to your protocol that involved changes to the consent form, and you should download that one.
Thanks. That was my only question.
Oh, was it? All right. Well, thank you for participating in this training on consenting subjects and documenting that consent. Hope you have a great day.